Welcome to Security Architecture Podcast, where we help cybersecurity professionals to stay ahead of the curve and ensure they are successful in their cybersecurity journey.
Good evening, afternoon, or morning. Welcome everyone to Security Architecture Podcast live event. We have three amazing guests from season 2 of our show. Our first guest is Jason Garbis. He's a Senior Vice President of Products for Appgate. Jason is responsible for the company security product strategy and product management. Jason, please tell us more about yourself.
Great. Thanks, Evgeny and Dimitri, and it's terrific to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So yes, in my role at Appgate, I am responsible for product management, product strategy, and I think one of the most interesting parts of that role is the fact that I have the opportunity to talk to so many different customers and prospects and really get a picture across a wide variety of enterprises, understanding their problems and their challenges as they try to move forward into this world of zero trust. I also have a volunteer role outside the company where I'm a co-chair of the Cloud Security Alliance working group on software-defined perimeter and zero trust. So in that role, I collaborate with folks across the industry. We write research papers and update specifications and things like that. And I also just finished writing a book that'll be published shortly called Zero Trust Security and Enterprise Guide. I'm looking forward to engaging with Alex and Amit and both of you. Thank you.
Awesome. Our second speaker is Amit Brackett. He's a CEO and co-founder of Perimeter 81. Amit is a cybersecurity expert with extensive experience in system architecture and software development. Amit, what else would you like us to know?
So thank you very much, Evgeny, Dimitri, Jason, Alex. I'm very happy to speak with you today. My name is Amit. As you mentioned, I'm the co-founder and the CEO of Perimeter 81. We are an Israeli cybersecurity company based out of Tel Aviv, where our brilliant engineers and the team is working on developing the product. While we have also two offices, one in New York and LA in the US. And we are developers of secure network as a service or SASE solution. We have more than 1,300 customers all over the globe. And I'm very excited to be here today and to make a fruitful discussion.
Awesome. Our third speaker is Alex Marshall. Alex is the Chief Product Officer of Twingate, which he co-founded in 2018. A focus of Alex's career has been using the power of design thinking to make technology complex products intuitive and easy to use. Alex, it's your turn.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys, and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So as Evgeny mentioned, so I'm Alex Marshall, Chief Product Officer, co-founder of Twingate. We started the company a couple of years ago, and one of the things that we really noticed is that there were a lot of zero trust products out there, but a lot of them actually were just very hard to use. And so we saw a really big opportunity in creating a zero trust product and framework that people could deploy really easily and be successful with. And we think this is a really, really important problem for companies to solve. And looking forward to the discussion with you guys.
Awesome.
All right, so let's start with our discussion. And the first question we would like to bring to the panel is let's have a discussion around the pros, cons, and limitations of clientless versus clientless approach. And now let's start to Jason answering it.
Great, thank you. It's a really interesting topic, a lot to talk about. I think really the whole premise of it is one that I think we need to surface, which is when people have that discussion, very often they're thinking about things from a user perspective. And I would encourage folks to think about really the breadth of zero trust needs to encompass not just user access to resources, but server to server access and access to and from other types of things like IoT devices that aren't users and may not even be considered identities. From a user perspective, the end user perspective, which is often how customers start, there clearly is a distinction and oftentimes discussion about client-based versus clientless access. And the trade-offs are pretty interesting. It's having a client on the device clearly provides significant capabilities in terms of deeper device introspection, the ability to enforce actions or require actions on behalf or by the user. And of course, the ability to natively capture network traffic of all protocols, TCP, UDP, ICMP, et cetera. And those are really important requirements in some situations. In many cases, of course, in most cases, employee devices do and will have software installed on them already and are centrally managed. So deploying another agent or component onto that device is usually not a high hurdle to put in place. Now, clearly, there are other user populations as well, oftentimes customers or third parties for whom it's impossible for the security team or the IT team to mandate the installation of a client. And in those cases, of course, most vendors, I would say, have a clientless option that would just utilize browser-based access. And of course, there's trade-offs, right? You lose some of the capabilities to do deep device introspection. You're typically limited to web protocols that can run from the browser. And that's kind of framing it up. I'm happy to open the conversation and let's talk about this.
Yeah, no, I agree with Jason. I mean, I think largely what it comes down to is really like what the use case is. So what we've seen in conversations with customers is that, if you're looking for a lot of like really like detailed knowledge about like exactly what device you're using, what the history is, do you manage that device, then a client approach often makes more sense. Again, as like Jason mentioned, you can capture all protocols. Doesn't matter whether you're using a browser or SSH or a database client, that kind of stuff. So there ends up being a lot of this really like high correlation in convenience and security. But yeah, I'm curious to see what Amit thinks as well. But I think on the clientless side, that tends to be sort of limited to use cases where, for example, let's say it's like a contractor or an outside vendor, where you really don't have control over the device, and maybe your security requirements aren't quite as strict because they need access to a narrow set of resources. But that's kind of what we see in customer conversations.
Amit?
Failed
on my first try, but generally speaking, I totally agree. I think that it's not this or that. It's this and that. There are advantages for an agent that basically supports all protocols. Running on layer 3 allows you to not only give access to network resources, but also secure the connection itself and offer additional services like different secure internet services, for example. And agentless, which does not require any installation, right? It's super easy to use. And also allows you to segment a network access completely. So giving a user or an employee or a third party access to application within a network without giving him a network access, right? Without him to be on the network. So I think it's, as I mentioned, this and that, where managed devices of organizations usually will run an agent, while the unmanaged devices and the third parties that you will work with partners, right? You can give access to applications specifically through a browser, through an agentless approach, which really complements each other. And you can use also an agentless application while using an agent. So it's not contradicting, but I see it as a whole and as a complementary solution.
I think it does come down, to the use cases for sure. And you could definitely make the case for if an enterprise already has existing tools that are running on the endpoint, and they're able to utilize those tools successfully for doing things like device posture checks and policy enforcement. And they have a reliable way for the zero trust component on the server side or on the controller side as a policy decision point to introspect or to make API calls to, let's say, an endpoint detection system. I think you can make the case that says, well, yes, these are my employees, and yes, these are managed devices, but I've got an endpoint detection component or antivirus running on that device. And the use cases only require, let's say, web access or web traffic access. I think you can make a legitimate case that says these users don't need full network access. I can get by with a clientless approach through a browser, and I have other security components in my architecture that my zero trust policy decision point or policy enforcement point can talk to. And then I trust that enough, it gives me enough credibility or confidence that I don't need additional device introspection directly by the zero trust agent.
Thank you. Amit, I have a question to you. I'll basically start with you. What do you think is next with ZTNA? ZTNA is pretty new on the market, but people already talking what's the next level and where it can go.
Yeah, so I think there's clearly two main things that happening in the world. One is employees are working to work from home, and two is that resources are moving to the cloud, transforming the corporate network from an on-prem infrastructure base to basically the internet. The internet is the new corporate network, right? There are still the same principles. There are still users that are accessing internal resources while being outside of the network. There are still users that are accessing the internet, and there are still resources that need to communicate with each other. ZTNA basically covering the remote access use case. But still, there are additional use cases that are part of every day-to-day work of an organization. For example, browsing the internet securely, or interconnect between different branches, or cloud environments, and so forth, that will need to be covered through a cloud-based solution, instead of being consumed from the on-prem firewall. And here comes to the play SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, which is a terminology that Gartner coined in August 2019. The ZTNA is a part of it, but not only. And we're going to see ZTNA to be natively integrated with SASE solutions as a bigger platform to address those use cases for organizations, and to develop two additional solutions delivered from the same management platform, the same network that exists in the cloud edge, and the same agent or agentless version client that is installed in the managed devices, right? There's a single solution delivering user-centric cloud security to companies very, very easily.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I think the whole space is just super rich for innovation, because if you think about what's really happening today is that the entire world is moving from a network membership based security model. So I'm on this network, therefore I can access certain things, and that's how everybody's thinking today. They're gradually thinking about zero trust, obviously, but I think even as you go down this zero trust path, I think what ends up happening is that people realize that they can start thinking about their network and access quite differently. So to give you a couple examples of just going beyond basic access to resources, is I think customers are starting to realize that all that expensive specialized on-prem network hardware that they had to protect their corporate network, that's a lot less important, right? You don't necessarily need a NAC to control who has access to the corporate Wi-Fi, because in a zero trust model they don't have access to anything anyway, right? Unless they're properly authorized. In another area, forensics gets a lot better, right? So if you go by the model of in zero trust that every single network connection is authorized and authenticated back to user's identity, it gets a lot easier to track down what actually happened if you need to trace down an attack or suspected attack. And the last area that I think is actually super rich for innovation is actually making applications more zero trust aware, because a lot of what we're doing is making sure that the network connection that gets delivered to the application is authorized and authenticated, but sort of the responsibility sort of ends there, and then we just hand it off. But I think that there's a really rich area for applications to be more aware of a zero trust framework and do that handoff more seamlessly. So I think there's a lot of things that can develop from that. So I actually think there's a lot, but we, as you're saying, again, there's still a lot for us to do, even at this early stage. So.
It's still, as big as we think the zero trust market is, I think it's still very much early days. If we look at it from a technology adoption lifecycle point of view, I really think that the next big thing is the early majority of organizations that aren't early adopters or leading edge folks are really now looking at zero trust and saying, okay, this is important. This has become the dominant design or the perceived and agreed upon best approach toward architecting security solutions today. So, we really see that organizations are embracing the whole zero trust principle of securing all access for all users and really looking at what's the most scalable, supportable, and maintainable and operationally efficient platform that I can use. So where I can define a policy model for all my users, regardless of whether they're remote or on premises, and regardless of what type or location the resources are that they're accessing. But we're really seeing a lot of mainstream organizations with pretty significant zero trust programs. They're investing in those types of initiatives. That's definitely something that we see happening pretty frequently this year.
Great. So this brings us to the question to Alex. Alex, in your opinion, how can a customer better prepare his organization for ZTNA transformation? Is there anything that you can recommend them doing prior engaging in such activity?
Yeah, well, and I think it's actually a great follow-on to your last question, because what it really comes down to is that we spend so much of our time like educating our customers, right? There's clearly like a desire to have better security and like an easier experience, and of course over the last year we've seen how terrible VPNs can be, but I think it's still getting people fully on board into zero trust, that there's still a lot of education to do there. So I think what we've seen and what our customers have been responding to really well is making sure that that process of adoption is like as easy as possible. I think we all know in the past, enterprise products that have been the perfectly secure solution or the perfect product, but if they weren't easy to adopt, they weren't successful. So we're really, really focused on that, because that's really what we're doing, is we're getting everyone to change the way they think about networks. So I think from a customer adoption standpoint, if you're going through a zero trust deployment for the first time, I think there's like a couple key constituents in this. Since largely most of the use cases are user accessing a particular application, it's first of all, make sure the user experience is really straightforward. And so that means that on Tuesday, that's the last day we're going to use the VPN or whatever the existing solution is, and Wednesday morning, users should be able to turn on the zero trust application, basically leave it running and not know that anything is operating any differently. So I think that as you're prepping, is make sure that that is going to be like the solution you've chosen is going to give your employees that experience. I think on the admin side, it is trickier. I'd be willing to bet a good amount of money. I'm sure Jason met in the same boat. Is that if someone hasn't already adopted zero trust, the chances that they have an accounting of every internal application that exists and what users are supposed to access them is pretty much I'd bet there's zero, almost, if not zero customers, almost zero customers that have done that. So I think it's making that easier for them is important. And so what we found works with deployments is approach things incrementally. All right, so you've got your employees on the ZTNA product. Next step is provide the same level of access that you provided before. And so since most people using VPN are providing pretty broad, CIDR ranges or wildcards on DNS domains, that kind of stuff for access, is do the same thing, and you've already incrementally made an improvement, right? You've improved your security posture. You've removed sort of the external sort of gateways into the network, and you've got people on the solution. So now you've got everything that's things are more tightly audited. And then have people sort of go about their daily work and use that information to feed it back into the way that you control access. So now that you know what people are actually doing, you'll see what groups they fall into, what types of applications they're actually accessing on a regular basis, and you could feed that back into the product, then gradually start trimming down access. And so I think this is sort of part of this incremental approach of step by step get to the sort of ultimate sort of zero trust nirvana, but don't expect to do that up front. And so that's how we've been coaching our customers through deployment.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, Alex, and fully support the incremental approach, because if organizations try to take a very broad and very strategic big bang type of thing, they'll never get the project off the ground. I do want to emphasize that organizations, of course, have a wide variety of maturities, and that it's important for folks to understand that they don't need to have a perfect identity system or a perfect CMDB or visibility or a perfect set of operational processes. That zero trust is what you make of it, right? It's a set of principles and a philosophy building on a platform architecture, and it's up to you to interpret that in a way that's right for your organization. So I think that when you think about this, recognize that you're never going to have a component and any element of your organization that's perfect, and that's okay. Zero trust systems can and will integrate and let you adapt and smooth out some of the inefficiencies and the complexities. And that it's great to find some tactical first projects where there's some real pain. And it may be a VPN replacement. We see that very frequently. But there's also other new types of projects, whether it's a cloud migration or a DevOps initiative, even an M&A activity, that lend themselves really well to the types of capabilities in Zero Trust and are oftentimes really good first projects because they're in many cases uncharted territory or represent a real headache for operational or application teams.
Yeah,
Amit?
Yeah, I just said, yeah. Oh yeah, go ahead, Amit. Yeah.
I think that the most important point have been said already, which is the gradual deployment. I think that ZTNA is a software-based solution, right? Just like Office 365, very easy to implement. You don't need to jump all in at the beginning. You can start very small and to expand and to grow with your deployment on the go, right? You can either start from cloud only or only from QA or freelancers that you work with or whatever, third parties. And then as you get more confidence to do that transition. We don't believe that on-premise infrastructure will disappear in a day. It will take some time to make the transition. Zero trust network access is something that definitely the first step to do the transition. And we see that with all our customers, that the best way to truly consume it in the best way possible is to start small, start with one use case to understand the concept and the principle, and to slowly think how it can be implemented within the organization and grow together with that transition that all the companies throughout all the world are doing today, of understanding that cloud first and mobile first world is today, right? What we thought that going to be in 5 years, basically because of COVID just accelerated overnight. They need to adjust. And luckily, there are great solutions out there to make it possible.
So all the listeners that right now on listening to us, please ask questions. You can type your questions in YouTube and we will see them and we can ask our participant. So please do it. I want to follow up on the topic that Amit, you mentioned, that this cloud first and mobile first. So if everything moving to a cloud and I need to access a cloud application and I have a ZTNA rule, would it be a ZTNA security control, or it will be security web gateway control that's supposed to secure such traffic?
It's a good question. I think it divides well, basically the resources. If the resources in the internet, then probably it will be Swig. If the resources in your own infrastructure, where it is on-prem or in the cloud, right, in AWS account infrastructure as a service, then it's ZTNA. That's how I would basically frame it. You can think about it like as we call it. ZTNA, it's more outside to inside, right? How you basically allow user to access internal resources while being outside the network. And Swig and CASB and security to SaaS applications are more inside to outside, right? I'm inside the network and I like to go out to an outside application like Salesforce, like a website, or so forth, right? The ZTNA is more in the outside to inside, and the Swig is more in the outside to inside to outside.
I think it's a little bit of a blurry line there. There's definitely this distinction between accessing private resources and accessing public resources. And Gartner, in one of the recent research notes, made this distinction between what they call ingress SASE, which is really ZTNA, and egress SASE, which roughly corresponds to Swig. I view it as, I think it's important for people to understand that these two worlds have very different, almost inverted policy models from one another. So ZTNA is all about enforcing the principle of least privilege. And that's, of course, really, really important for resources on private or privately controlled networks, which is you're not going to have access to anything on this network until and unless you're authenticated, you've met the criteria that we've assigned. And even then, you only have the minimum level of network access to an explicit set of policies that we've created. A SWIG policy model, of course, on the other hand, is completely the opposite. It's really, we're going to prevent you from accessing things that we believe are bad or inappropriate on the internet, but there's no explicit list that says, oh yes, you can go to office.com or your favorite news site.com. So it's a very different approach. We certainly do see enterprises using ZTNA to access and protect access to SaaS applications. Now, clearly, the value proposition is a little bit different, but those enterprises have made the calculus that the additional device posture checks and the ability to validate through various forms of strong authentication is appropriate for those SaaS applications and for those users. And very often they use that in conjunction with the same platform to control access to private applications.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's like sort of it's pretty nuanced. I think it depends. I think it's developing. I think just to add to what Jason and Amit have already said. Plenty of our customers, similar to what Jason just said, want to restrict access to certain SaaS applications. It tends to be, I think, the applications that are more sensitive. So, for example, like payment gateway management platforms, or anything where there's like a lot more like sort of sensitive company information. I think this also like harks back to something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is that right now, the way that if you want to do that as a customer, really the only option you have today is IP whitelisting. So some combination of single sign-on IP whitelisting, but there's not the SaaS provider is really saying, well, anybody can access your tenant on the internet. We're only going to rely on user authentication. If you want to do network level restrictions, well, you have to rely on IP whitelisting, and that's not great. And I think most ZTNA products can support that, but it's really not an ideal solution. So I think this goes back to I think we'll just sort of see how things develop as zero trust becomes like a more broadly adopted concept. But I think for the SaaS application to be zero trust aware, I think would present some like pretty interesting integration opportunities. And so one additional example on that is I think the trend with SaaS has been that things that were homegrown or that were part of private networks have become productized. And so a good example of that is actually CI/CD systems. And a pretty common use case that we're running into with our customers is that they have CI/CD pipeline they're managing on a third-party service that needs to access certain components internally. And so that definitely, to use Jason's phrase, definitely blurs the line between, is this a what's appropriate here? Client solution, client list? Is it a user? Is it a service account? Is it a cloud-to-cloud connection? What is that? And so I think that's where it starts getting really interesting, as we start seeing individual components that were previously developed internally get productized and spread out into third-party apps.
Alex, you mentioned something interesting, which is these SaaS applications or the SaaS platforms tend to only rely on authentication level access control. And while IP whitelisting can and does help at the authentication time, that tends to be the only point during a session lifecycle where that's actually enforced. There's certainly some unsolved problems in the space where someone can authenticate through that mechanism, get a valid SAML token, and then an attacker could steal that SAML token and use it on a completely different device from a completely different network location. And in many cases, those SaaS applications can't and don't detect that. And that's a vulnerability that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very great points. And now we have a question from the audience. So the question been asked by Vladimir. And the question is, do you have a solution for overlapping networks? So based on this question, I'm assuming that's the common problem in the VPN when you have the same subnet as the subnet of the network you're connecting to. And then when you send your ARP request, they just go to your local network and your local broadcast domain. How it's been solved by ZTNA?
I'm happy to jump in. I'll talk a little bit how we've approached this. So obviously, ultimately what it comes down to is a mechanism for routing packets from your local device to that target network. And we certainly have lots of enterprise customers with lots and lots of overlapping or duplicate private IP spaces. And the mechanism that we approach for that, of course, is having a process for assigning what we call network entitlements to the users, such that they only get access to the network devices or the IP addresses, the resources that are assigned to them. And the way we've approached the routing is we have a very fine-grained approach so that you can have overlapping networks and you'll get the capability to send your traffic to target resources that have adjacent IP addresses, even if they're in conflicting networks in different locations. Obviously, you can't access two resources with the same IP address at the same time, but the dynamic mechanism that we utilize for assigning these network entitlements, and then some of the business processes that can be associated with it, such as requesting access and having it approved and then having it provisioned automatically, are a way of compensating for that. I hope that made sense.
I think this is a great call to have IPv6 finally deployed. That we wouldn't have this problem. Yeah,
hallelujah.
Yeah, I know. Everybody can have their own huge range. But no, I think it is an issue, right? Especially if like larger networks. I think there's really two things. Like number one is I think when going back to the education thing, like when people are rethinking their infrastructure, it's a really great time to have them do some planning around that. That's a relatively rare occurrence that they're doing those two things at the same time. But the advice that we've been giving is actually to rely on internal DNS more extensively, and it actually makes it easier for everybody because if you can assign names to addresses, you can still have overlapping addresses, and it doesn't matter on different networks, and the naming is obviously much more flexible. So that would be my recommendation in terms of like if you're starting to think about going down this route, zero trust, and having like very complex networks that potentially have overlapping ranges, is naming is actually a great solution for that.
Excellent. Amit, would you like to add something to it?
Yes, generally speaking, we have a solution for that. I don't want to be too technical, but one of the advantages of SASE solution or ZTNA service is that it's all software-based, right? It's logical. So it's all about how you build your network in the building blocks and do the mapping and the configuration in the cloud very easily in order to support that. Specifically in Perimeter 31, you can create different networks in the cloud, right? And to interconnect the different overlapping networks to different networks and to assign the resources to the users without any issue. You can also solve interconnectivity between those overlapping networks easily with Perimeter 31. But I would be happy to jump on a demo session and to explain and to demonstrate it with you, Vladimir.
Excellent. So the next question is to Amit, and that's actually a very painful topic based on the events we have witnessed last year. How can we use ZTNA to reduce our attack exposure for ransomware attacks?
Interesting. So, look, basically, ZTNA, one of the principles that allows you to hide all your network from the public internet, right? Some services that are attached today to the regular firewall are exposed by mistake or intentionally to the public internet, which allows attackers to find vulnerabilities and to inject network vulnerabilities or malware to the network that will basically encrypt the files and trigger a ransomware across all your organization. By implementing a ZTNA, not only you are hiding your complete network from the public internet and reduce your attack surface significantly, you are also mapping your resources and creating segmentation within the network between your internal employees and increasing segmentation and reducing the exposure.
Yeah, and I think. Oh yeah.
Go ahead, Alex.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like two big things that I mentioned. One of those, right, which is, yeah, let's lock down. If you lock down your perimeter, right, this is like basic hygiene, and if you can lock it down so your internal networks are completely invisible, that's clearly part of what needs to happen. I do think that, with ransomware in particular, I think what tends to happen. Well, okay, of course, there's all kinds of attack vectors, but if we're talking about ransomware, the entry point tends to be an employee's device. And so there's a bunch of things you can do there. Like, one is, well, think about like how was it that they were actually, what was it that led that ransomware to land on their device? So there's basic sort of like internet, DNS filtering. We talked about Swig earlier and so on that you should be doing. But the second thing is that if you are using a zero trust product, you're sort of automatically reducing the blast radius, because even if your employee has access to an internal network, it's not like VPN where they have access to the entire range. And so you're automatically, on a per employee basis, reducing what anybody can access internally. And then that, of course, I think the sort of like, as you follow that, then you start to realize, well, actually, it's probably a certain set of employees that are more likely to have more access to more sensitive internal systems, become more interesting targets for ransomware. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you think about sort of internal defenses, you can start to focus a lot more scrutiny on the people that have access to the more sensitive internal systems. So I think that there's, we haven't even talked about lateral, probably because lateral movement internally, but I think adopting this new model lets you go down this route where you can more quickly respond to anything that happens. And then finally, like as we were talking about before, because every network connection is linked back to user's identity and their device ideally as well, then any traffic can be tracked down on the internal network back to a source. And so again, you can more quickly figure out like who was it that was sort of patient zero for the ransomware attack. So I think there's actually quite a lot of benefits that come from going down this path.
So Alex, what you're saying is that lateral movement is harder, and the incident response is faster.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, exactly. So it's once you get it's what you're really limiting is the number of entry points to go in via an authorized method. So if you got ransomware in device and the user isn't aware of it, there's only a set of things that they can access. So that's limited. If you want to go down sort of the lateral movement path, of course, once an attacker gets to an internal system, it's still up to you to go through the proper, as a customer, proper process of ensuring that you've gone through microsegmentation, review of your network, or you're using another microsegmentation product to ensure that there isn't a lot of lateral movement. But at a very basic level, with ZTNA, what you're preventing is people just having broad open access for someone to sniff around. At least they have less things that they can access.
Yeah, if the premise is we have a device on the internal network that's been compromised, whether it's a user or a server, then absolutely. The principle of least privilege helps by, as Alex said, reducing the blast radius and ensuring that each user only has a minimum set of capabilities or resources that they have access to. The interesting thing about ZTNA is that it also really helps the security operations team, because number one, it's reducing the amount of traffic and the amount of noise on the network, and it helps the SOC people, SOC engineers, or the SIM really reduce the number of false positives. And ZTNA can also help you establish a much more effective type of a honeypot, because clearly, if everything is only accessing authorized resources, if something is touching our honeypot there, chances are that it's malicious or anomalous, and it should be looked at. And then finally, on the server side, the approach of microsegmentation really lets you determine how broad or how narrow what the NIST document calls this implicit trust zone is, and helps you focus on that and understanding the traffic in there. And if all of a sudden you're seeing anomalous activity, you really have the capability through these set of distributed policy enforcement points to respond quickly and compartmentalize any sort of exposure for attack.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, because it's not just about the sort of north-south traffic. It's thinking about, okay, once people are in there, now your job isn't done. Once you've figured out the north-south path, it's really, I think it's a great point. It's like figuring out like how do you limit traffic internally, and then that's true. I mean, like also it allows you to identify traffic that shouldn't really be there. So I give like one customer example. We had a customer that was seeing a bunch of traffic to an internal database, And they looked at sort of logs in our product, and they didn't see anybody accessing it. So that allowed them to like very quickly like focus on determining whether it was actually coming from a person or some other kind of service or some kind of like open port somewhere. So it let them like figure that out much more quickly. So I think that's a great example in practice.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. I think as organizations make this transition where they go from not having identity-centric view to having at least a partially identity-centric view, it's much easier to winnow out and say, okay, we understand this, and we don't understand this over here, and this is a problem to be solved or potentially anomalous activity. And we found that the zero trust solution can, because it takes this identity-centric view, can inject that set of enriched logs into a SIM, for example, and really amplify the capabilities of the incident response team or even the SOC or SOAR solution to pinpoint problems and tie them to actual sources much more easily.
I would like to add a point about that. Basically speaking, with zero trust, not only you are making your network invisible, right? It's basically implementing a deny all and approach and allow only what's needed, right? And we have Alex mentioned the customer story, but I think it was 2 weeks ago, one of our customers called us very excited that basically his company was bought by another company, and the other company was under a ransomware attack, and only his company wasn't affected, although they were on the same network, because they basically were in an isolated denial, accept only what is needed network of perimeter 81 within the larger organization, right? And it basically prevented from that ransomware to spread around and to use services that are vulnerable, either with 0 days or CVEs that weren't patched because they were practically blocked on the network level. So that's also an important piece to emphasize.
Great. We have a question from a listener, and it's an interesting one because it's related to one of my favorite sectors, banking and finance sector. They have a lot of people. I remember still making a deal with a bank. We end up having like 15 or 18 signatures to close a deal with special cloud committee as well. How do you see when you work with financial institutions? How do you explain to them that it's safe? This is where the internet is going. Very good question. Thank you, Humberto. Looks like nobody wants to be first.
Yeah, I can.
Who doesn't love the financial sector?
I can jump in. Basically speaking, business comes first, right? Banking were always avoided. Banks were always, and financial institutions always avoided from exposing the resources to the internet. One day COVID came, everyone needed to work from home. What are they gonna do, right? Stop, they close the bank. They have to keep business going. And this is where basically COVID made the reality clear enough to understand that cloud and mobile are here to stay, and they need to find the solutions to support it. So either they utilize their current on-premise hardware and infrastructure that is very vulnerable, requires a manual intervention with updates, management on a site-centric level, or to look for new technologies and methodologies in order to A, increase productivity and allow business continuity, and B, implement a solution that is cloud first, mobile first. We see smaller financial institutions that are coming to us and implementing it very quickly, and financials are one of our top three today, top three categories, together with healthcare and tech. But we do see larger banks today are approaching and to evaluate how they're going to make that transition, right? Because the current SOS solution, basically utilizing the on-premise hardware that wasn't exposed to the internet, and basically either allowing access from example only from a specific IP address of the employees, right? They're calling in the morning to the IT manager, the employee, hey, I'm working from home, this is my IP, please whitelist it to allow me to connect, right? It does not scale, and it's not a solution for the long run. And we do see them are now evaluating modern solutions, and we'll definitely make that transition in the next year or two.
Yeah. I think just to add to that, I mean, so I actually spent a number of years working at Bloomberg, running a product there, and so I've worked with a lot of large banks. I guess what I've noticed is I think if you go talk to sort of like large institutions, they've actually already done a huge amount to sort of like lock down access because obviously they have a lot to lose, and so pretty typical scenarios for people working from home is it's Citrix-based access, and you get pixels and you don't get access to anything else, right? You're connecting to a remote or a virtual desktop somewhere in the office. And so they've already, in a lot of ways, sort of like ahead of the rest of the industry because they have so much to lose from a breach. However, I mean, I think banks are often, their technology organizations are obviously, are often very forward-looking. And so they're always sort of like looking at sort of like where technology trends are going. And I think as soon as there's sort of like a critical mass for a new technology, they are actually fairly quick to adopt it, right? Once they see the values there. But I think the situation is sort of special with financial services at the moment because while there's obviously all the value in ZTNA that we've been talking about, the trade-off that banks are making is that they've already locked things down so tightly that they're feeling pretty safe, I think, in a lot of ways, with how a lot of their employees are accessing things, is that the new technology has to be that at least as safe as that was, and also be straightforward for people to use. That there's like a pretty high bar there actually to move along. But I do think as like zero trust gets a broader level of adoption, becomes more of a standard, and we've worked out some of the kinks and so in the industry. I do think banks will sort of join that sort of general middle majority and jump on board. So
yeah, we're definitely seeing a pretty broad spectrum of folks in the financial services sector, some of whom have really jumped on board and embraced this. And I'll give you one example, which is a customer of ours that we've done webcasts with, which is FINRA. And FINRA is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority in the United States. So they're, the regulators for the regulators here. They very publicly embraced a infrastructure as a service using AWS and a big data platform. And they've utilized our technology to support that transition. That's kind of one example way over here at this end of the spectrum. And the other side, we have more traditional, more conservative banks. And we really believe that customers and enterprises need to have the choice. And the way we've approached things is to provide a flexible deployment architecture where customers may choose to route things up through a vendor managed cloud, or they might choose to manage all the components themselves. And that's especially important for either sectors or regions of the world where they might have tighter regulations or have compliance constraints around them that prevent them from really being leading edge.
Great, thank you. When I work from home, I connect to applications in my data center or to my office, and I may download something. And then I may trigger DLP, data leakage prevention. Is this should be part of ZTNA or not, or shouldn't? And if it should, how would you approach to this? How would you actually prevent me to download something, or you will alert me on this case?
So it sounds like you need to behave yourself a bit more, not downloading things you shouldn't. So I think that with DLP, it's definitely a very real concern. I actually, so one of my first jobs is we were OEMing technology to DLP vendors. This is more than 15 years ago. So it's clearly a very complex problem. And it also hasn't been fully solved, but I think the complexity involved in it, I think from my perspective, I think indicates that it requires, I think, a lot of like dedication and focus from like a dedicated vendor to DLP. So I think from our perspective, I think if a ZTNA product is going to start to go down this path of sort of deploying sort of DLP type capabilities, 80% success rate isn't good enough, 90% isn't good enough, 99% isn't even really good enough. So I think from our perspective, we'd rather leave that challenge to someone else, but just make sure that you work like really closely together with them so that you can help like supplement it. However, having said that, I think that for a lot of the same reasons that we were discussing around ransomware. If you, for your situation, Evgeny, if you're downloading something, because every connection is linked to somebody, it's going to be pretty easy to determine, after the fact, who actually downloaded the information. And one of the things that we didn't talk about earlier is that this identity-based model is really strong in terms of sort of supplementing information and SIM systems and so on, because every connection comes back to someone's identity, not their IP address. It's a lot harder to figure out IP addresses after the fact than it is the user's identity. And so I think that's sort of like the second point, is that you can really correlate all that network traffic information with what the DLP platform provides and get a much richer picture of what happened. And then I think the third thing is that is actually it really is a disincentive question, right? So if every employee knows that there's this thing running in the background that gives them access to applications, and they have to sign in to be able to access the network, I think they are going to be disincentivized to do something like that when it's going to be so easy to track them down. So I do think it's like a combination of things. It's definitely a very, very tricky problem to solve, but I think like shining a light on network activity, tying it back to identities, and being able to like more quickly respond, I think works together to discourage that type of behavior.
Yeah, if you think about, I think one of the biggest pieces of value that a zero trust solution provides, it's this identity centric and contextual view of access. And we really think that, I agree with Alex's point that DLP solutions are specialized technology, and it probably will remain as a standalone component. But I do think there's a really good, interesting opportunity in our industry to start to enlarge the boundaries of zero trust and enable zero trust integrated or zero trust enabled either applications or infrastructure components. And DLP is a great example of this. And this concept has been around for a while. If you look at how Google approached this with BeyondCorp, which they started 7 years ago, was the first white paper, they did something really interesting, which was they had their component, the zero trust policy enforcement point, and they actually took, because this is all web traffic, they injected additional security and identity context in the HTTP headers that were then sent to those web applications. And the beauty of this approach was that the web applications that had no idea just simply ignored those HTTP headers and they did their usual function. But the web applications that were, in their world, BeyondCorp aware, right, zero trust aware, started to consume that information and do something useful with it. So I think we'll start to see, hopefully in a standardized way, DLP solutions that will do something similar, which is, hey, I recognize that this user is connecting to me through a zero trust policy enforcement point. I'm going to get some additional context through some technical means, doesn't matter. And then I, as the DLP solution, will do something more interesting. And maybe I don't let Evgeny download this because he's working from home, so I'm going to block the data or obfuscate the data. But tomorrow he's in the office, great, he gets to see it. I think that's new territory for us as an industry, and it'll be really exciting to see that over the next few years.
Great. I don't think we have any more questions. Actually, there's one question from Felipe about API, and I guess it's more related to product versus API in general. But it is an interesting one. We have more and more SaaS applications that are API driven. Is ZTNA plays in API security as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, and I think there's a second part of this question. There's maybe like two sides. This, like, one is, I think the only way, given that generally ZTNA is operating at this sort of network level, I think it has to be possible to configure it via API. And so I think that gets its whole sort of interesting conversation around infrastructure as code and so on. And I think customers are definitely going that way. They're using public cloud, you're spinning up instances in AWS. As soon as they do that, you want to programmatically be able to assign who has access to those things. And so I think that's part of the question. I think the other part of the question here is sort of like API driven security. I think, again, it goes back to maybe the beginning of the conversation where we're talking about, is client or clientless the right approach? How do you make sure to intercept that traffic? How do you set rules? Are you talking about a human user or like a service account? And so I think it would depend a little bit on what the context is. But I think that, again, as we're talking, I think this conversation tends to start sort of like this north-south conversation of like users accessing internal applications. I think the API security model starts talking more about like east-west, and I do think that is like an area where zero trust is like very ripe for expansion internally.
Yeah, I think when you think about APIs, there's so many different dimensions. There's, as you mentioned, there's the whole security as code concept, which is, okay, my security infrastructure needs to be able to be receptive to maybe a DevOps CI/CD type of pipeline and automatically change the infrastructure of the policies. We've also seen a lot of customers be very successful using the APIs from the Zero Trust platform itself. And this can take the form of either metadata-driven access policies that utilize attributes of a target resource, like a security group or a tag in a cloud environment that can then become input into a policy and drive which users would get access to which resources. And then the other piece is utilizing APIs exposed by business processes. So a great example is, I want to set up a policy that ties to my service desk and only allow users access this resource if there's a service desk ticket that's in the open state that's assigned to me or my group. That's a very common system administrator-driven access control, because on any given day, an admin might need access to 10 servers to fix them out of a pool of 1,000. And the principle of least privilege tells us we don't want that administrator to have network access to all 1,000 of those resources every day. So it's another really interesting and useful way. That use case resonates a lot with customers of utilizing APIs to drive access.
Yeah, that's a really good point on ServiceNow, and I think the other thing that brings up is time-based access, right? So we tend to think about how do we give someone access, but then we forget about the problem of like how do you make sure you take that access away when it's no longer required. So it's either you have to renew it every 30 days, or we automatically detect it's unused, or things like that. So I think that I think it's a very rich area.
I would like to address the API driven security as well as the DLP. It's something that is more broader. I think ZTNA needs to be looked at as part of a bigger play of basically speaking, move away from the traditional box-based infrastructure and security to a secure network as a service, a solution that basically delivers both networking and security from the cloud. And there are different use cases. There's the remote access piece, which is being covered by ZTNA, right? And there is a secure internet pieces that will cover with the different services developed on the same platform, the same network, the same bloodstream, we call it, of the organization that today exists as a software in the cloud. And of course, range of different cybersecurity solutions that can be easily delivered from that platform, right? And this is how we see in our thinking that cybersecurity will go through some kind of unification. Today, you go to, not today, but last year before COVID, you went to a big cybersecurity conference. You see so many vendors, so many solutions, so many different services that usually integrate to the network of the organization, which is the firewall. In order to make the deployment, you need to do a POC internally to install it, either on a VM or somewhere inside your network, and to start and basically secure some of your services. That transition from a physical box, right, we call it drop the box, to a cloud-based solution that is software-based, software-driven, right, allows you to create that unification of those services, and even to create partnerships between cybersecurity companies, whether it's an API security company that would like to deliver its service over on top of that platform, right? A platform that includes a single management console, a single network that exists in the cloud edge, and a single agent that is installed on the user devices. And this is where I think everything connects, right? Moving away from buzzwords like SD1, CASB, SWG, ZTNA, into basically a platform to deliver and democratize network and security to any company from any size easily, and to make that unification, that beautiful connection between all those services in order to deliver the best-in-class solution that is really tailored around the user and the resources, no matter where they are, inside the office, outside the office, in the cloud, or on premise.
Makes a lot of sense. We have another question, and I think we'll have to wrap up. Oleg asks, what about SMB market? So the target here is about companies between 250 to 1,000 employees. Do they look for adopting ZTNA? So probably if can give some share some experiences, what kind of company size you are working with, and who you're seeing as the lead adapters for such technology and approach.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick answer. I mean, I think from our standpoint, we see a huge number of leads in that market segment, and I think even larger than that. So maybe we call that the mid market. But yeah, I mean, I think what tends to be happening is that companies, as they grow, get up to a certain size and then realize that this is a problem for them, and then they're looking for a solution, and they start looking, and they discover Zero Trust, or maybe they already knew about it. But that there sort of becomes this time when you have enough critical mass, enough people accessing things, and the complexity of managing it is hard enough. Security becomes like a big enough concern that that sort of triggers adoption. So that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, so with the second, Alex, I think that definitely the mid-size and SMB market will and now making the first movers, right? They usually work either from the office and now need to work remotely. They don't have time. They don't have the people to install a VPN appliance or a firewall appliance. They didn't invest in that before. They still work with the cloud. There are many companies that are today, even small businesses that are utilizing cloud services like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, and it's the secure access. And it's a very natural transition for them to consume such a solution to the cloud.
Yeah, I would say Oleg and others who work at organizations of that size is don't let the breadth and the giant vision for an all singing, all dancing Zero Trust platform be an impediment. We've seen plenty of enterprises be very successful in that range of 100, 200 users or 100, 200 employees that get benefits from a more focused Zero Trust approach. Because ultimately, hiding your resources on the network, ensuring that you have a efficiently enforced policy model, and enforcing the principle of least privilege is a great benefit no matter how many users you have.
Thank you, everyone. We actually done with the live show. It's 1 hour passed very, very fast. Thank you, all the guests. Please quickly tell us where people can find you in case you want more information. And we also will post information later on when we publish the episode. Amit?
Yes, definitely. We'd be happy to book an online demo. You can go to perimeter81.com, enter your email, and register on the demo on the spot. We're working 24/7 and be happy to speak with you in person.
Thank you. Jason?
Yes, so please check us out. You can find more information at appgate.com. We have obviously lots of information available. We've got a test drive for the product. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach me on Twitter. I'm just at Jason Garbus. And thank you, Amit. Thank you, Alex. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, so same, we're all the same, right? But like Twingate.com, you can find more information on our product. You can sign up for the product for free and give it a go, or talk to our team for a demo. But yeah, really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks everybody for the time. It's been really enjoyable.
Please don't forget to follow us on YouTube and check our website as well. We're releasing shows every Thursday. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.